In my parents' house there was always Angelica this and Angelica that. So obsessively that it seemed to me as if the walls in this house were whispering her name. Even when everyone was silent, my older sister couldn't do anything wrong in their eyes while I was around, and this unspoken rule seemed to be fixed in the air, in every family dinner, in every phone call, in every glance they gve me, full of polite but indifferent assessment. This has always been the case as far as I remember from the very first years when I still did not understand why only Angelica was congratulated after a concert at a music school, even though we both played and I played harder. For most people, I am Patricia, an ordinary name that they see only as a competent, punctual, slightly distant woman in strict clothes and with an ideal reputation. And at the age of 27, I finally got used to being secondary in the D'Amico family, like an old portrait hanging in the hallway. You get used to it, sometimes you notice it, but almost never look at it carefully. Despite the fact that I was a disappointment to my family, I didn't get married on time, didn't give birth, didn't take my husband's last name, and didn't follow the path of like everyone else. I was doing pretty well. I had a good job as a corporate account manager and I received good money, which allowed me not to depend on anyone, not to wait for anyone's approval, not to be afraid of loneliness, although my parents never admitted it and stubbornly pretended that they did not understand what my job was all about. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. For the past year, I've been renting a nice little house in a quiet suburb about 30 minutes from the city center. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I could be myself in a space where there were no shadows from other people's expectations. I even had an ever-growing savings account dedicated to making a down payment on my own home, a goal I pursued methodically, stubbornly, and without anyone's help. Meanwhile, 30-year-old Angelica married her college sweetheart, Carlos, 3 years ago. They had a gorgeous wedding, which my parents spent too much money on, and I still remember how Dad, without once looking at my outfit, burst into tears of happiness when Angelica appeared in a white dress. Of course, I was a bridesmaid, dressed in a disgusting peach-colored dress, which Angelica specially chose because she knew I would look terrible in it, and she would shine against the background of my awkwardness. Today is a family dinner. On Tuesday morning my mom texted me, "Don't be late like last time." I sighed, looking at my phone, realizing that this dinner would be another act of the show called Angelica Shines, Patricia is Silent. But I answered shortly anyway, "I'll be there." And I went back to preparing for the morning meeting where, unlike family gatherings, I felt important. That evening, I drove up to my parents' house and immediately noticed Angelica's shiny new SUV parked there. Of course, she came earlier, probably helped her mother in the kitchen, earning more points for her beloved child. Everything is as usual, as if according to a script written by someone else, but played out over and over again. Invariably, dinner was as usual. Mom asks Angelica questions about her work at the real estate agency, nodding with admiration at every word. Dad is proudly silent as if he had achieved her success, and I picked at my food, answering direct questions as briefly as possible, trying not to give rise to another remark about my skepticism or inhospitality. Then, over dessert, Angelica cleared her throat theatrically, deftly attracting attention to herself. "Mom, Dad, Carlos and I have wonderful news," she announced, beaming, as if holding a golden ticket in her hands. I was preparing for the pregnancy announcement, already imagining how much worse my life would become when Angelica gave birth to her first grandchild and my parents would completely immerse themselves in a new, even louder adoration. "We decided to open our own business," she said, shaking Carlos' hand, and for a second I felt relieved. My parents burst into glee, and my mother even clapped her hands, as if Angelica had just invented a cure for all diseases. "Oh, darling, that's wonderful." Mom was ecstatic, almost trembling with happiness. "What kind of business? What is it?" she asked, not even bothering to look at me. "Luxury clothing boutique," Angelica replied, beaming. "We have found the perfect retail space in the city center." That caught my attention. I have a diploma in business management, for which I worked hard, unlike Angelica, who barely passed the exam for a license to operate in the real estate industry. I restrained my irritation and asked, trying to keep my tone neutral, "Have you conducted a market analysis? Retail trade in the city center can be very competitive." Angelica rolled her eyes. "Don't start, Patricia. Not everyone needs to think about everything as much as you do, she snorted. I'm not exaggerating, these are the main business issues. Have you calculated the initial costs, the expected income, and the time to break even? See, that's why no one likes to talk to you, Angelica said sharply, and her voice slapped me in the face. You don't know anything about fashion retail, it's my passion. Angelica straightened up as if preparing for the final chord. Actually, there's something else. First, we need capital. The room became quiet. I had a bad feeling about where this was going to lead. We were hoping, Angelica continued, looking at our parents, that you could help us, maybe take out a mortgage on a house. As soon as the business takes off, we will refund your money with interest, that's for sure. My jaw dropped. They've owned this house for 30 years, it almost paid off. This is a terrible idea, I blurted out before I could stop myself, as if the words had burst out on their own, burning in the air between me and my whole family, whose reaction was not long in coming. My father tensed as if I had hit someone at the table. My mother looked down at the salad, and Angelica, she flared up instantly, as if she was waiting for this reason to unleash all her accumulated anger on me. Mom, Dad, you can't risk your home for a business that hasn't even started to bring in a dime yet, I continued, more restrained but with the same inner seething, especially when it comes to the retail business, where the failure rate in the first 2 years is simply catastrophic. The business won't fail, Angelica insisted, raising her voice, her eyes flashing, and her lips trembling with indignation, as if I hadn't expressed concern, but had directly attacked her dreams. God, Patricia, you're just jealous because Carlos and I are risking what we believe in while you spend your life in this corporate prison of yours. I asked, not believing that it had all come down to that ancient accusation again. I'm trying to keep Mom and Dad from homelessness. It's not envy. It's common sense. No, you just want me to fail, Angelica screamed, jumping to her feet, her chair sliding back with a loud creak. You've always been jealous of me, Patricia. You can't stand the idea that I can succeed and earn more money than you, despite all your cool business degree and manager's arrogance. There were tears in her eyes, the same skillful, rehearsed, fake ones that she had used since childhood to get her way. Every time her arguments ended, I got up from the table slowly, as if giving myself a second not to snap. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and be accused of something I'm not doing. I turned my gaze to my parents, trying to find at least a drop of support in their faces, but I found only concern and evasive sympathy, which really meant nothing. Mom, Dad, please think about this carefully before making any decisions. That's what we'll do, dear, Mom said, but her voice sounded tired and lifeless, and the look she cast in Angelica's direction said more than any words. She had already decided which side she would be on. I said goodbye to my parents, ignored my sister and her husband, who didn't even bother to look me in the eye, and left, feeling anger and powerlessness twist inside into a tight knot. On the way home, I couldn't get rid of the feeling of heaviness in my stomach, as if I knew in advance that everything would go exactly as I feared. I knew exactly what would happen. Angelica would cry and manipulate, my parents would give up as always, and somehow I would turn out to be the bad guy, despite all attempts to prevent a catastrophe. 3 weeks later, during an important work presentation, my phone rang. I ignored him, continuing to talk about a strategy for a new client. But when the call immediately came back, I apologized and left the meeting room, sensing something was wrong. Hello, Patricia. It was my father, and the fact that he said my full name immediately alerted me. He seemed tired. His voice was dry and with a kind of dull echo of regret. We gave Angelica and Carlos money for their business, he said, and I closed my eyes, leaning against the wall to keep my balance. I asked, already knowing that the answer would hurt. We have refinanced the house, $200,000. Jesus, I whispered, gritting my teeth. Dad, everything will be fine, he interrupted hurriedly. They have a solid business plan. Angelica showed us everything, tables, forecasts. I bit my tongue so as not to say what I really thought, and after a long pause, I exhaled. I hope everything works out, and hung up, returning to the room where the client was waiting, but already knowing that the day was over. Almost a year after my parents mortgaged their house, on Tuesday evening at 11 o'clock my doorbell rang. I haven't slept yet. I was just looking through my work documents, lying on the couch with a cup of cold tea. When I opened the door, I saw my parents. They looked as if they had aged 10 years in one day. Mom's eyes were swollen from crying, her face was ashen, and Dad seemed hunched over, as if his spine could not withstand not only physical but also moral gravity. He didn't say anything, just looked right through me, as if he couldn't believe he was standing in front of my door again. Not as a parent, but as someone who needed help. "We lost the house," Mom said, almost in a whisper, and I realized that the moment I was so afraid of had come. "I'm not saying I told you so," I whispered, but the broken faces in front of me stopped me from any reproaches. "Come in," I said instead, stepping aside, opening the way for them not only to my house, but also to a new reality where their daughter, whom they had never really believed in, was now their only refuge. I gave them my spare bedroom that night. We didn't talk much. They told me only the most necessary things. Angelica and Carlos's boutique went bankrupt after 8 months. They invested everything in overpriced inventory, rented an unaffordable space in the most expensive area of the city, spent part of the funds on business trips to fashion shows, which in fact turned out to be just a vacation overlooking the catwalk. When the business collapsed, the parents were unable to pay the mortgage, and the bank, unwilling to understand the circumstances, notified them of the seizure of the house the same morning. The next day, I called my boss and asked to be allowed to work from home at least temporarily. He was surprised but agreed. I helped my parents move the few things that the bank had allowed them to pick up: boxes of family photos, some clothes, and the porcelain dishes that my grandmother had given my mother for her wedding. "It's temporary," Dad kept saying as we moved the boxes into my rented house, "until we get back on our feet." I nodded, not knowing what to say because every word would either sound like a lie or a rebuke. 2 weeks later, there was another sensational news, one that seemed to completely erase the boundaries between reality and some kind of prolonged absurd farce that my daily life was gradually turning into. I returned home after a rare day at the office, tired but pleased with the silence that the evening promised me. And already at the moment when I was driving up to the house, I noticed Angelica and Carlos' car in the driveway. Black, with a slightly scratched door and dirty wheels, it looked just as out of place against the background of a neat courtyard. As well as their appearance at this moment, when I opened the door and went into the kitchen, I found my sister sitting at the table, looking as if she owned the place, as if everything around her belonged to her by birthright, and not because I had silently clenched my teeth and given her shelter again. Carlos was sitting next to him, hunched over, staring at the floor, and there was something new in this pose. Not only shame but also confusion, like a man who finally realized that there was no way out. "Here she is," Angelica said without getting up, with a strained smile that didn't even try to touch her eyes. I asked, putting my laptop bag on the floor and feeling like the whole day full of numbers, presentations and calls was being washed away into one growing tension in my chest. Mom came out of the kitchen sipping tea. "Angelica and Carlos need to live somewhere," she said, avoiding my eyes. "The landlord of the apartment evicted them because of rent arrears, and you let them stay with us." I looked at her, trying to keep my voice level because I knew all too well that any expressed irritation would be used against me. "We're a family," came from the living room where Dad was sitting, staring at the TV, as if he didn't realize that his word now weighed much more than it seemed. "The family sticks together?" I looked at my sister. At least she had the sense to feign a little shame, but I knew her well enough to know that it was just a thin film of politeness over the confidence that everything would work out in her favor again. "We'll help," she promised, as if she were reading from a script. "I'll clean up, Mom will cook, you won't even notice that we're here." What could I do? Putting your homeless family out on the street? I was not one of those who could fall asleep knowing that my mother was sleeping in the car, even if she had taken my help for granted in recent months, so I agreed, swallowing all my irritation, and accepted their terms, even though I already knew it would be a temporary truce with a predictable outcome. The first month was tolerable. I worked late, returned home, where dinner was already on the table, and despite the awkward conversations and the feeling that I was a guest in my own house, we somehow coexisted. My parents settled into the guest room, Carlos and Angelica in the office converted into a bedroom, and I stayed in my room trying to limit communication to a minimum. The house was definitely too small for 5 adults, but we managed. However, cracks began to appear at the beginning of the second month. When I came home one day, I found a mountain of unwashed dishes in the sink, left over from dinner. which I did not participate in. Mom stopped cooking for everyone, citing fatigue and age. And now everyone arranged their own meals, of course, from the products that I continued to buy. I went into the kitchen and saw 2 pots. One left by my parents, the other by Angelica and Carlos. Both were empty. I have nothing left but empty packages and a dirty stove. It happened again the next evening. And the next, of course, I could have mentioned the agreement again, but I chose a different path. I started having dinner at a cafe near the office, which became an additional expense item that I couldn't afford. But at least it saved me from the humiliating feeling when you feed 5 people and stay hungry. Angelica's promised weekend cleaning was becoming more and more rare, almost ghostly each time. There was a new excuse: fatigue, headache, an important meeting with a stylist friend, or just forgetfulness. One Saturday morning, when the calendar had already passed the middle of the 3rd month of their stay in my house, I had had enough. I didn't go to the store as I had done before, but stayed in bed with the book that I had been trying to finish reading for the 3rd week. In the late afternoon, the family returned from some distant relatives and found that the refrigerator was empty. Mom came into my room without knocking, with an expression on her face as if I had offended the honor of the family. "There's no food in the house," she said accusingly. "Today is Saturday. You always go shopping on Saturdays." I closed the book without losing my composure. "I decided not to do it today," I replied calmly. "When were you going to tell us?" "We're hungry," she continued, raising her voice. "I'm tired of buying products that disappear before I can eat them. From now on, everyone can buy their own food." Mom's face turned frighteningly red, as if I'd hit her instead of telling her the simple truth. "After all we've done for you," she began. "Did you do it for me?" I interrupted. "You live in my house, the tenant. I just asked you to cook and Angelica to clean up. Neither of these things are happening anymore." Mom turned around and ran out of the room, and soon I heard her complaining to Dad and Angelica in the living room, their voices getting louder and filled with righteous indignation. I put on my headphones and returned to the book, plunging into a fictional world where everything at least obeys logic. The silence lasted a week. It was childish, of course, but at the same time strangely peaceful. I bought myself a separate mini fridge and put it in the bedroom where I put my groceries. I came and went without talking to anyone, and no one tried to talk to me. It seemed like a Cold War where both sides were waiting to see who would blink first. But eventually, this tension began to fade slowly without words, like a receding fog after a thunderstorm. One evening, when I was tired but satisfied with the day, I was going to my room with a takeaway dinner, a hot container in one hand and a bottle of water in the other. My mother suddenly approached me, lingering in the passage between the kitchen and the hallway, as if waiting for the right moment to speak. "Patricia, can we talk?" "What is it?" she asked, pronouncing my full name with that special tone in her voice that always meant seriousness, anxiety, or preparation for some important statement, which always made me wary inwardly. I nodded silently, feeling a faint irritation simmer in my chest, muted only by fatigue, and followed her to the kitchen table, where Dad, Angelica, and Carlos were already waiting for me, sitting with equally focused faces, as if rehearsing expressions of collective remorse. "We've been thinking," Mom began, glancing back at the others for support, as if she didn't fully believe in her own words and needed confirmation that everything that was going to be said wasn't being said by her alone. "Things haven't been going very well lately." Her voice faltered, and at that moment Angelica, who was sitting next to her, hurried to intervene, as if she was afraid that if she didn't say something, I would think that this was another manipulation. "We want to fix this," she said, and her voice, usually harsh and smug, now sounded quieter, more muffled, almost embarrassed. "We know we haven't done our job." I raised an eyebrow, holding on to an ironic smile, but said nothing, giving them a chance to explain themselves without pushing them into conflict. "We would like to return to our original agreement," Mom continued, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'll cook dinner for everyone, and Angelica will clean up on weekends if you start shopping again." I looked at their faces, trying to figure out if they really realized how far they had come, or if this was just a temporary game to regain their comfort. Dad, who is usually an integral part of this trio, couldn't meet my eyes this time, as if he suddenly realized his helplessness and inability to manage the situation. Carlos nervously fiddled with a paper napkin, avoiding any movements that might draw attention to him. Angelica, although she tried to look contrite, could not completely hide the look of calculation in her eyes. She knew how to put pressure on me. Why such a sudden change? I asked, letting a slight wariness creep into my voice. We miss our family, Mom said, looking down. And to be honest, none of us can afford to buy groceries separately. At least it was honest. I considered the possible options, realizing that even if my brain resists, my heart is tired of the eternal confrontation. The truth was that I also missed real home-cooked food, the aroma of frying onions in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, and dinners where, even though it was strained, there was still a general conversation, and the silence, no matter how peaceful it was also starting to feel lonely. Okay, I finally said. I agree, but if it starts all over again, that's it. I will not allow myself to be used in my own home anymore. Everyone nodded so readily, as if this was exactly the phrase they had been waiting for. And that's how we returned to our original agreement, carefully, step by step, as if we were balancing on thin ice, trying not to make a single unnecessary movement. Everything went really smoothly for a few weeks. Mom, as if by magic, returned to her culinary duties, preparing hearty dinners, casseroles, stews, homemade soups, everything that smelled of childhood and comfort. Angelica really cleaned on weekends, carefully, even meticulously, as if she was trying to prove her good faith. And I made sure that there was always everything necessary in the refrigerator. Of course, we didn't turn into the Brady family. No one started singing hymns at the table. But a kind of tolerant routine was established between us, in which at least everyone knew their role and respected it. One evening in early November, I felt that something had changed in the house again. When I got home a little later than usual, I saw that Mom, Dad, Angelica, and Carlos were already sitting at the dining table. And as soon as I entered, the conversation stopped. They exchanged glances, quickly, subtly, but enough for me to understand that they were talking about me. I hung up my coat, washed my hands, and went into the kitchen, where my mother was serving lasagna with almost unnatural joy, and her smile was too bright, almost painted. We were just talking about Thanksgiving in just 2 weeks, she said, trying to sound casual. Okay, I replied, accepting the plate. I'll have to work the day before, but I can help with the cooking on the day of the celebration. A series of silent glances followed at the table again. Actually, Angelica began, putting down her fork and averting her eyes. We were thinking of doing something different this year. We thought it would be nice to leave here. Just a little vacation to clear my head after everything that happened this year. I stopped in mid-sentence when Dad suddenly perked up. There is a wonderful resort in Sedona. They have a special Thanksgiving package, with all the traditional food but no work, plus hiking, spa treatments, all that. I looked at them. That sounds expensive, I remarked, continuing to eat, trying to keep my voice calm. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the clatter of forks on plates. That's why I asked, I finally said. Are you inviting me to come with you? Because I already said that I will be working this week. Oh, we know you won't be able to go, Angelica quickly interjected. So we decided that now is the right time for us, so you don't get upset that you're missing an opportunity. I put down my fork. If you all know that I won't be able to go, why are you telling me about this? I asked, looking directly at her. There was another awkward pause. Do you want me to pay? I said in a flat voice, and at the same moment everything came together in my head in a familiar pattern. That was the whole point. Mom reached across the table and gently patted my hand. Don't pay, just a little help. Everyone needs a rest. It's been such a hard year. Do you want me to pay for a vacation that I won't even go on? I asked, already knowing the answer. You can afford it, Angelica said with that same note in her voice that always sounded like her unbidden superiority. We all know how much you earn. It's not that, I replied, feeling the pressure build up inside me, as if an internal spring was about to burst, and then I would finally stop holding back. The fact is that you are asking me to pay for a luxurious vacation for 4 adults, each of whom does not make the slightest contribution to our common household, does not consider it necessary to participate in the expenses, but at the same time has the audacity to demand comfort, as if it were his birthright. We are a family, Dad said with his usual confidence, as if this very phrase, uttered in the right intonation, was supposed to erase all my arguments, doubts, grocery bills, and unpaid bills at once. And your mom and I are not getting any younger. We deserve to enjoy our golden years just a little bit. And Carlos and I are still recovering. Angelica added, shrugging her shoulders, as if it wasn't them who had led themselves into bankruptcy, but some kind of external disaster, natural and inexplicable. It may be years before we get back on our feet. I looked at each of them in turn, at my father, who still believed that his role was to provide imaginary moral support, at my mother, whose tired eyes searched for pity, not responsibility, at Carlos, still sitting silently and clearly annoyed that, in his opinion, I was not generous enough, and finally at Angelica, whose expression was a mixture of resentment and habitual condescension. These people, my family, who it would seem should have loved and supported me, looked at me as a credit line with an unlimited limit, as a resource that can and should be used until it runs out. No, I said. I won't pay for your vacation if you want to go to the resort for Thanksgiving, please, only at your own expense. But we can't afford it, Angelica began, but I interrupted her before another round of manipulation could unfold. Then you won't go. That's how money works. If you can't afford something, you don't get it. It's selfish, Carlos said, suddenly breaking his usual silence, and his voice was heavy with a hint of reproach. After everything your family has done for you. I laughed bitterly, not hiding the irony. What exactly have you done for me lately? You live in my house, eat the food I pay for, and take advantage of my generosity at every turn, as if I were your servant and not an adult woman who also has the right to rest. We raised you, Mom said, and her voice was trembling, either from sincere feelings or from an attempt to put pressure on guilt once again. We sacrificed for you. And I've been paying off this debt for months now, I replied. But I'm not spending money so that you can afford to relax while I'm working and carrying it all on myself. The rest of the dinner passed in silence, heavy and dense, like a gray fog in which it is impossible to breathe. When I finished eating, I excused myself and went to my room, locking the door behind me, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to shut out their stares, their claims, and their dissatisfaction, at least for the night. I could hear them talking in the living room in hushed but angry voices, and every new whisper, every reproach uttered in a low voice, echoed hollowly in my head. I turned on the TV and turned up the volume to drown them out, so that to some extent I could feel like the mistress of my own silence again. The next morning, they still treated me coldly, no good morning. No looks, just a tense atmosphere from which the air seemed to have been drained. I left for work without saying goodbye, and I, fully focused on the large project that I supervised, I stayed in the office late, and was one of the last to leave, rather than return to this suffocating atmosphere that poisoned even the walls of my house. It became my new routine, getting up early, hanging out late, minimal interaction with anyone at home. No one spoke to me directly, no one asked for forgiveness, but I increasingly heard them whispering to each other as they passed the kitchen or bathroom, abruptly falling silent when I appeared. One evening, a week before Thanksgiving, I stayed in the office longer than usual. The project was nearing completion, and everything had to be adjusted to the last detail. When I finished, it was almost midnight. The office was empty, the cleaners had long since left, and I felt completely exhausted. All I wanted to do was get home, take a hot shower and fall into bed, forgetting about that day. The drive home was quiet, and the streets were empty, as they should be on a weekday night. I drove up to the house and immediately noticed that there were no lights on in any of the windows. Were they asleep? For a second I felt better. No talking, no fighting, just silence. I went to the front door, pulled out a bunch of keys, and inserted the key into the lock. He didn't turn around. I tried again, gently rocking, thinking that maybe the lock was stuck. Winter was approaching. The metal might have tightened a little, but no, the lock remained stationary as if it had just been replaced. I took out the key and looked at it under the porch light. It was my key, the one I used every day. And then a thought struck me, cold as a blow to the spine. They changed the locks. At first disbelief came, a stupid, naive, no, this can't be happening. But then it was swept away by a wave of rage. I started knocking on the door, cautiously at first, then harder and harder, until I punched with such force that I was no longer just knocking on wood, but on my own patience. I know you're there. Open the door right now, I shouted, pressing the doorbell and holding down the button until the ringing bell turned into an annoying, high-pitched howl. There was no reaction, no footsteps, no voices, no movement. But then I saw something flicker behind the curtain quickly, almost imperceptibly. Someone was at home, someone was watching me, and yet he didn't open it. I knocked again, louder. I see you, open right now. There was no response. I stepped back, peering into the dark windows, when the light in my parents' room on the second floor flickered, and someone's shadow carefully opened the blinds and looked down right at me. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I automatically pulled it out and looked at the screen, hoping it was a message from work, or anything to avoid another blow to my already exhausted nerves. But hope immediately faded as soon as I saw the sender's name. Mom. I read the text, and although the words were neatly typed almost formally, they left a feeling of being punched in the stomach. We won't let you in until you agree to pay for our vacation. It's for your own good, Patricia. You need to learn to be less selfish. I stared at the message, not immediately realizing its meaning, as if my brain was trying to isolate itself from reality, not letting it in, as if this line on the screen was just a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything but what it really was. An attempt to blackmail by people whom I recently called family. My own mother, the one who was supposed to protect me, locked me outside the house, which I paid for, maintained, equipped, in which I invested not only money, but also strength, patience, hopes, and now used it as a lever to get money out of me for their vacation. I stood on the porch, clutching my phone in my hand, looking at the dimly lit windows behind which the betrayal was playing out, and I knew that I could have called the police. I had a lease signed in my name, I had the keys, I had the payment, I had the rights, but something inside me stopped this impulse. Maybe it was a residual illusion that there was still something more between us than mutual claims, or maybe it was simple fatigue that spread through my body like cold lead. I turned around and returned to the car, turned on the stove at full power, pulled on my coat, curled up in the driver's seat, trying to find at least some comfortable position in which I could forget. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted each time by the temperature in the cabin plummeting after I turned off the engine, saving gas. Knowing that I couldn't afford the luxury of staying warm at dawn, I woke up completely shivering, with an aching lower back and a shiver that went to my bones. I watched as the lights started coming on in the house, as familiar silhouettes moved behind the curtains, as a new day began, without me, with my family, but without my participation. Around 7 in the evening, when it was already getting dark, the front door opened and my mother came out onto the porch. She walked up to the car with such confidence, with such a radiant, almost triumphant smile, that my insides tightened with anger. I rolled down the window just enough to hear her, not wanting to let her into my personal space an inch more. "Did you have time to think about our conversation?" she asked politely, with the same intonation that cashiers use in stores when they offer anything else. As if I hadn't spent the night in the car at my own house, as if it was all an ordinary, unremarkable request, I nodded slowly, feeling a kind of amazing clarity envelop my mind, burning out the remnants of doubt. Yes, it was. Her smile widened, her eyes sparkled, and there was no remorse or understanding in that expression, just relief, as if I had finally admitted my guilt. "Good, then you can go back." I got out of the car, feeling every joint protesting, and stretching my back, followed her to the door. Inside, Dad, Angelica, and Carlos were sitting at the kitchen table, having breakfast peacefully, as if they hadn't participated in the violence the night before. They looked up at me, and I could see the same mixture on their faces: feigned concern, complacency, and an unbearable, almost caricatured confidence in their own rightness. "Good morning, Sonia," Angelica said, grinning. "Do you want pancakes?" I didn't say anything, didn't even deign to look at them. She walked past him, straight into her bedroom, closed the door behind her, and immediately called her boss. I explained that I urgently needed to take time off for family reasons. Fortunately, he didn't ask any questions. I rarely took days off, and he knew it. When the conversation ended, I lay low, listening to the family going about their business. Footsteps in the hallway, switches clicking, keys clinking. One by one they left the house. The parents went to their part-time jobs, Angelica and Carlos, who knows where, maybe again for interviews. The house was empty around 9. I quickly went to the closet, pulled out the suitcases that I had saved from my last vacation, and began packing my things methodically, without fuss, as if I were preparing not for an escape, but for an ordinary trip. Clothes, documents, laptop, toiletries, a couple of photos, a few knickknacks that mattered to me. Everything else, furniture, dishes, curtains, became unimportant. Then I dialed the landlord's number. "I need to cancel the lease," I told him. He immediately became alert. "Is something wrong with the house?" "No family problems," I replied shortly. I need to move out as soon as possible. I explained the situation without unnecessary details, saving face, but making it clear that it was no longer possible to live here. He reminded me that the contract requires 30 days' notice, and then I offered to pay for the next month in full if he released me from further obligations. To my surprise, he agreed immediately without haggling. Leave your family there until the end of the month if necessary. He said, I'll deal with them later, no penalty. Thank you, I said, really grateful. Can I ask for one more thing? Could you stop by today and let them know? I'd rather not have this conversation on my own. He agreed again, without asking the reasons. Leaving the formalities behind, I loaded the car with everything I could fit. Bags, boxes, suitcases, the rest books, furniture, seasonal clothes. I decided to move later. To do this, I immediately called the nearest warehouse and arranged for temporary storage. Then I wrote to my friend Emma, who lived on the other side of town, a woman with a rare gift for hearing between the lines and not demanding explanations when there could be no explanations. And as I had hoped, she immediately offered me her guest room, saying that I could stay with her as long as I wanted. It will be required without specifying what happened, and without demanding anything in return except perhaps the presence and the opportunity to share a bottle of wine in silence. By noon I had already left without looking back, leaving nothing I couldn't live without. Everything important, truly valuable, was with me in the car, in my suitcases, in my memory, with the intention of never letting anyone reshape my life to fit someone else's needs. When I left, I felt a strange lightness, one that does not come abruptly, but seeps into my blood drop by drop, washing away the remnants of guilt, tension, obsequiousness, the habit of being needed, obligated, infinitely accessible from the inside. For the first time in several months or maybe even years, I did not feel this oppressive burden on me, stuck heavy like a wet blanket, the expectations and demands of my family, their must, is it difficult? Just, which drowned out all their own authentic real. That evening, calls and messages began to pour in like an avalanche, like a digital panic attack. The phone vibrated almost continuously, from Angelica's angry accusations, full of caps and insults, to trembling voice messages from my mother, which were interspersed with tears, hysteria and desperate attempts to persuade me not to destroy the family. I didn't answer. At first I was just silent, then I turned on the do not disturb mode. And after a couple of hours exhaling, I turned off the phone completely, and in that silence, for the first time in a long time, I heard my own breathing, my thoughts, myself. The next day, when I was back at work and trying to get into the routine like an armor, the receptionist called me. Your family came to see you, she said with a slight doubt in her voice. I went down to the lobby and saw them immediately. My mother in tears, my father theatrically clutching his chest as if in physical pain, Angelica in her best suit, with a pleading but insincere expression on her face, as if she had come not to apologize, but to sell another story. I took them outside, not wanting to make a scene in front of my colleagues, and they immediately attacked me. They persuaded me, promised to change, begged me to give another chance, my mother sobbed, clutching her hands to her chest, claiming that she would have nowhere to go when the landlord demanded to vacate the apartment at the end of the month, and my father muttered something about age, about the heart, about family, and Angelica talked about responsibility, mutual assistance and how everything should be. I listened to them with the same detachment that I had previously observed only in others. Doctors in the waiting room, lawyers, police officers, and people tired of lying. I was surprised at how calm my voice sounded when I waited until they were exhausted and said, You chose this, you locked me in my own house and made me sleep in the car. You've shown me how far you're willing to go for your own gain. So if you really think that you don't have a roof over your head anymore, now you can do. The same cars are parked nearby, park, make yourself comfortable. I turned and walked away, leaving them in the middle of the sidewalk among strangers with their tears, their hands, their words that no longer had power over me. 2 weeks later, I moved into a new apartment, simple but cozy, on the opposite side of the city, with windows where the sun knocked in the morning, not reproaches. I blocked their numbers, deleted them from social media, and took them out of my life as carefully as a tumor is cut out, leaving nothing to grow back. The owner of the old house confirmed that they had moved, but did not say where, and I did not ask. I no longer cared. I didn't know where they were now. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't care. In this new silence I was left alone, not alone but in freedom. There was no one to please, there was no one to serve, no one stood behind him with hints, reproaches or demands. My money was finally mine alone, my savings, freed from the needs of 4 adults, each of whom believed that I owed him, began to grow, and for the first time in my life, I realized that the dream of owning my own home was not a mirage, but a reality that I was approaching every day. Sometimes on particularly quiet evenings I found myself wondering if I was being too cruel by cutting off all ties with them completely. But then I remembered that night in the car, icy, lonely, painful. I remembered the months of manipulation, the years of invisibility, and realized that this was not cruelty, it's a choice, my choice, the only correct one. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.